You know what time it is? Get into it! It's gonna be a wonderful night because we are back with Storytime with Chris. With my favorite book of all time. I was just messaging a friend about this earlier. I have a whole list of the top 50, top 25, top 10, top 5, top 3. This book is number 1. The only other book I can think of that I love as much as this, or as equally, would probably be... Well, actually... Yeah, probably be between these 3 books. So there's The Neverending Story, The Skull of Truth by Bruce Colville. Great book. Great book. The first time as a kid that I saw LGBT representation in an American novel. And I'll explain why that is later on. And then Charlotte's Web. Those are the top 3 tied for number 1. I can't explain it. Like, the stories are so amazing and very relatable. They taught me a lot of life lessons in the time that I had read them. This book really pushed the idea that one should be grateful for what we have in our world. Yes, books are worlds in and of themselves and we can escape, but our world here can be just as magical and just as fantastic as the world of Fantastica as we are about to be introduced. Now, I know I'm on here early. I said 7:30, but I decided to get on here a little bit early. Just to talk to y'all. Charlotte's Web is tied because Charlotte's Web, whether my auntie Diane and my mom realized it or not, because they used to read the story to me and I watched the movie, which is great. I'm not a huge fan of the live action movie they did. It wasn't good. I don't feel like you needed to turn that story into live action. It just doesn't work. I love Charlotte's Web because it was the book that taught me how to handle death as a child. How to not necessarily embrace it, but to acknowledge death for what it is and to handle it in the best way. Because when Charlotte, spoiler alert for those who haven't read the book, which I'd be very surprised if you hadn't, spoiler alert, Charlotte does die at the end of the book. It's one of the most heartbreaking portions of that book. And for me, I love the story of Charlotte's Web because it teaches about death. It teaches about the humility of unconditional love and kindness and goodwill. And a lot of us really should take a lesson in that. Like, Charlotte literally did not have to do half of what she did for Wilbur. She didn't. She could have minded her own business, stayed in her web, and just lived out the rest of her days for however long. But she saw, and she says it in the story, she says that, you know, we grow old, we live a little while, and then we die. What's a life anyway? I feel as though, I'm trying to quote as directly as possible. She said, you were my one friend, Wilbur. Maybe what I did for you lifted my life for just a trifle. So what she's basically saying was in that story, she's like, you know, I did this not for recognition, but to just lift you up and show you that there is good in the world. And that's what Charlotte does, is that she shows him that people are good, man is good, and people can change and learn and atone and grow from their mistakes. And she dies. It's an incredibly heartbreaking scene. I remember reading that on Storytime, not last year, but the year before. Well, no, I did. Was it last year? Or the year before? No, it was last year. It was last summer. My mind is elsewhere. It was last summer. I read Charlotte's Web. I didn't read it this summer. That's what it was. Anyway, just a heartwarming book. It's hilarious at points. It's got really great, points about life and, unconditional love. She has nothing to do with this animal. She loved Wilbur enough as if he were her own kid. It's just an amazing story. And then The Skull of Truth by Bruce Colville comes from a series of books by Bruce Colville, which we're going to get to those books. They're called the Magic Shop books. And then his other series that is really, really popular is the Unicorn Chronicles. That is a 4-book series, which we definitely can get into. The first book is Into the Land of the Unicorns. The second one, which is my favorite out of the 4, is Song of the Wanderer. And then, which is a great, if you ever get to hear the audiobook, it's a great radio adaptation of that story. It's awesome. And then the third one is, Oh, come on, Chris. Oh, what's the third book called? Into the Land of the Unicorns, Song of the Wanderer, and Dark Whispers. And then the fourth one is... I can't remember. But the fourth one is pretty long. At least in the way that I was reading it. Anyway. Bruce Colville wrote a story called The Skull of Truth. And it is a story about a young man named Charlie Eccleston. There we go. Charlie is a habitual liar. He tells stories to, get along well with people and get people to be on his side, because he was accused of something when he was younger. And I'm not going to spoil the integral parts of the story, but I'm getting around to say that he goes to this magic shop and he finds this skull that is able to telepathically speak to him. And whoever holds the skull or has the skull in their vicinity is compelled to say the truth and nothing but the truth. It's a beautiful, simple book about the complexity of truth and how we utilize it in our day-to-day lives. How do we utilize it within our relationships? And how we use truth or covering of the truth to protect the ones we love, or even make people feel good about themselves. There's a lot of instances where, I was reading this, I was like, wow, if I had a skull that would compel people to tell the truth, what would my family say about me or about other people in our family that, are around us? It was a very awesome story. The ending is great. It has a kid who is Charlie's best friend. Brandon, I think his name is. Pretty sure his name is Brandon. And he is recovering. He's recovering from cancer. And there is this point where... Yes. So, at a point in the book, Charlie's favorite uncle, Benny, hangs out with Charlie. They go on trips together. They go to the movies. Benny's a hobby enthusiast, I guess is what you call him. He's a news reporter. He's a news cameraman, and he has a job, don't get me wrong, but he dabbles in different, crafts and music. Anything you can think of that he might find interesting, he's doing. He's always doing something. And Benny is revealed at one point in the story, because of the power of the Skull of Truth. He inadvertently, without intending to, because he isn't aware of the magic, he comes out to his family. And it's based off of the fact that his grandmother, if he's Charlie's uncle and that's Charlie's grandmother, would that make... Oh, okay. His mom, Charlie's grandmother. There we go. She blurts out, No, okay. So, I'm trying to get details together, so bear with me for 1 second. My mind is in two different places, because I'm trying to piece the story together without spoiling the whole story. So, in The Skull of Truth, Charlie's family is having a dinner party. It's Charlie, his two sisters, his Uncle Benny, his grandmother, and his mom and dad, and his aunt and uncle. And everybody's just spilling the truth about everybody, because they're not aware of the magic of the skull, because the skull in this part of the story is in the vicinity of the dining room. So everybody is telling the truth about themselves. And it is, quite honestly, hilarious. And at one point, Hyacinth Priest, who is a friend of Benny, joins them for dinner. And Charlie's aunt, I think her name is Aunt Hilda. Anyway, she asks him, "Oh, Benny, is she your girlfriend?" And Benny, just without realizing it, just says, because the magic of the skull, he's like, "Actually, Aunt Hilda, I don't have a girlfriend. I have a boyfriend, and his name is Dave. And if everybody would sit here and acknowledge that, it would make my life so much easier." And he just, gasped. He's like, "I can't believe I just said that." And there's this conflicting moment with Charlie, who, that's his favorite uncle. He had no idea that his uncle was gay. And the family, even in the midst of the magic of the skull being nearby, his Charlie's mother and father say, like, you should have given us more credit, Betty. You should have told us. Like, it's okay. Like, we would rather you live the truth than to just, live in the fraudulent life that clearly so many people have become accustomed to. I'm paraphrasing here. And there's this moment where Charlie has a conflict within himself, because he's like, well, I didn't know that my uncle was like that. Now I have to deal with this. And Hyacinth Priest actually gives him some pretty sound advice. She's like, are you worried about Benny? She's like, it's still the same relationship. He just happens to love somebody else. And then a very interesting moment happens with Charlie. A straight kid who talks to his gay uncle. He's like, you told me to never be ashamed of loving someone. And here you are being ashamed of telling us that you love someone. Is that going against your word? And he's kind of mad, but he's also like frustrated. Like, why couldn't you just tell me that Dave, your friend, is actually your boyfriend? And it was a really interesting way that it was written. That story did not blatantly come out and say that Benny was gay, but the fact that he addresses the fact that Dave is his boyfriend is very like subtle, and it's very relatable, because it's like, I know there will come a point in time where my nieces and nephews will see my partner, whoever that may be in the future, or will ask me about certain things, and I'm not going to hide the truth from them. I'm not ashamed of who I am. I'm not ashamed of where I've come from and whatnot. And that book really gave me confidence later in life that, like, if my nieces and nephews do ask me those questions, that I can have the wherewithal to answer them in the best way possible. And to be as patient and as loving and as open as possible with that conversation. It just gives me hope that, like, they'll love me regardless of who I love. And then the Neverending Story, as we are getting close to showtime, which I do not own the music that is being played in the background. We have 5 more minutes before showtime. I feel like I'm on a stagehand. Chris, you're on in 5. Like, but the Neverending Story, I saw the movie first. I saw the first and second movie when I was a child, on repeat. Loved it. It's dark. It's thrilling. It's fantasy. It's magical. It has such unique storytelling, because the story is not only set in the real world, but it is also set in the world of the book, The Neverending Story. And Bastian Balthazar Bucks, who is our main character, goes through a lot of growth in this book. He learns about what it means to show humility, being careful what you wish for in life, and being grateful for what you have here in this world. And he feels as though life is so difficult and hard that it would be better to just escape. And rather than escape, you have to face your demons, whatever they may be, and handle it. And I love that aspect of the story. But since I'm off my soapbox, and since it's getting time, we might as well start the story. And by the way, I love this print. I love this print. So, I'm going to just tell you a detailed note. All of the words... Yes. So all of the words in green are the words from the real world, and all of the words in red are those in Fantastica. So, The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende. And this is also a cool aspect of the book. You're going to see this sign. On my end, it's backwards because it's meant to be seen in a reflective surface. Carl Conrad Coriander, Old Books. The inscription could be seen on the glass door of a small shop, but naturally this was the only way it looked if you were inside the dimly lit shop looking out at the street through the plate glass door. Outside, it was a gray, cold, rainy November morning. The rain ran down the glass and over the ornate letters. Through the glass there was nothing to be seen but the rain-splotched wall across the street. Suddenly the door was opened so violently that a little cluster of brass bells tinkled wildly, taking quite some time to calm down. The cause of this hubbub was a fat little boy of 10 or 12. His wet, dark brown hair hung down over his face. His coat was soaked and dripping, and he was carrying a school satchel slung over his shoulder. He was rather pale and out of breath, but despite the hurry he had been in a moment before, he was standing in the open doorway as though rooted to the spot. Before him lay a long, narrow room, the back of which was lost in the half-light. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books of all shapes and sizes. Large folios were piled high on the floor, and on several tables lay heaps of smaller, leather-bound books whose spines glittered with gold. The far end of the room was blocked off by a shoulder-high wall of books, behind which the light of a lamp could be seen. From time to time, a ring of smoke rose up the lamplight, expanded, and vanished in darkness. One was reminded of the smoke signals that Native Americans used for sending news from hilltop to hilltop. Apparently someone was sitting there, and sure enough, the little boy heard a cross voice from behind the wall of books. "Do you're wondering inside or outside, but shut the door. There's a draft." The boy obeyed and quietly shut the door. Then he approached the wall of books and looked cautiously around the corner. There, in a high-worn leather-winged chair, sat a short, stout man in a rumpled black shirt that looked frayed and somewhat dusty. His paunch was held in by a vest with a flower design. He was bald, except for outcroppings of white hair over his ears. His red face suggested a vicious bulldog. He was smoking a curved pipe which dangled from one corner of his mouth and pulled his whole cheek out of shape. On his lap he held a book, which he had evidently been reading, for in closing he had left the thick forefinger of his left hand between the leaves as a kind of bookmark. With his right hand he now removed his spectacles and examined the fat boy, which stood there dripping. After a while, the man narrowed his eyes, which made him look more vicious than ever, and muttered, "Goodness gracious!" Then he opened his book and went on reading. The little boy did not know quite what to do, so he just stood there gaping. Finally, the man closed his book, as before, with his finger between the pages, and growled, "Listen, boy, I can't abide children. As far as I'm concerned, they're no good for anything but screaming, torturing people, breaking things, smearing books with jam, and tearing the pages. It never dawns on them that grown-ups may also have their troubles and cares. I'm only telling you this so you'll know where you're at. Anyway, I'm no children's books, and I wouldn't sell you the other kind, so now we understand each other, I hope." After saying all this without taking his pipe out of his mouth, he opened his book again and went on reading. The boy nodded silently and turned to go, but somehow he felt that he couldn't take this last remark lying down. Sounds a lot like me as a child. He turned around and said softly, "All children aren't like that." Slowly the man looked up and again removed his spectacles. "You still here? What must one do to be rid of you? And what was this terribly important thing you had to tell me?" "It wasn't terribly important," said the boy still more softly. "I only wanted to say that all children aren't the way you said." "Really?" The man raised his eyebrows in affected surprise. "Then you must be the big exception, I presume." The fat boy didn't know what to say. He only shrugged his shoulders a little and turned to go. And anyway, he heard the gruff voice behind him. "Where are your manners? If you had any, you'd have introduced yourself." "My name is Bastian," said the boy. "Bastian Balthazar Bucks." "That's a rather odd name," the man grumbled. "All those B's? Oh well, you can't help it. You didn't choose it. My name is Carl Conrad Coriander." "That makes 3 C's. The man grumbled quite right. He puffed a few clouds. "Oh, well, our names don't really matter, as we'll never see each other again. But before you leave, there's just one thing I'd like to know. What made you come bursting into my shop like that? It looked to me as if you were running away from something. Am I right?" Bastian nodded. Suddenly his round face was a little paler than before and his eyes a little larger. "I suppose you made off with somebody's cash box," Mr. Coriander conjectured, "or knocked an old woman down, or whatever little scamps like you do nowadays. Are the police after you, boy?" Bastian shook his head. "Speak up," said Mr. Coriander. "Whom were you running away from?" "The others." "What others?" The children in my class.
Why?
They won't leave me alone.
What did they do to you?
They wait for me outside the schoolhouse.
And then what?
Then they shout all sorts of things and push me around and laugh at me.
And you just put up with it?
Mr. Coriander looked at the boy for a while disapprovingly. Then he asked,
Why don't you just give them a punch on the nose?
Bastian gaped. No, I wouldn't want to do that. Besides, I can't box.
How about wrestling? Mr. Coriander asked. Or running, swimming, football, gymnastics? Are you no good at any of them?
The boy shook his head.
In other words, said Mr. Coriander, you're a weakling.
Bastian shrugged his shoulders.
But you can still talk, said Mr. Coriander. Why don't you talk back at them when they make fun of you?
I tried.
Well?
They threw me into a garbage can and tied the lid on. I yelled for 2 hours before somebody heard me.
Mr. Coriander grumbled. And now you don't dare.
Bastian nodded.
In that case, Mr. Coriander concluded, you're a scaredy cat too.
Bastian hung his head.
And probably a hopeless grind, best in the class, teacher's pet, is that it?
No, said Bastian, still looking down. I was put back last year.
Good Lord, cried Mr. Coriander, a failure all along the line.
Bastian said nothing. He just stood there as in his dripping coat. His arms hung limp at his sides.
What kind of things do they yell when they make fun of you?
Mr. Coriander wanted to know. Oh, all kinds.
For instance?
Namby-pamby sits on the pot. The pot cracks up, says namby-pamby. I guess it's 'cause I weigh a lot.
Not very clever, said Mr. Coriander. What else?
Bastian hesitated before listing. Screwball, nitwit, braggart, liar.
Screwball? Why do they call you that?
I talk to myself sometimes.
What kind of things do you say?
I think of stories. I invent names and words that don't exist. That kind of thing.
And you say these things to yourself? Why?
Well, nobody else would be interested. Mr. Coriander fell into a thoughtful silence.
What do your parents say about this?
Bastian didn't answer right away. After a while, he mumbled. Father doesn't say anything. He never says anything at all. It's all the same to him.
And your mother?
She's gone.
Your parents are divorced?
No, said Bastian. She's dead. At that moment, the telephone rang. With some difficulty, Mr. Coriander pulled himself out of his armchair and shuffled into a small room behind the shop. He picked up the receiver, and indistinctly Bastian heard him saying his name. After that, there was nothing to be heard but a low mumbling. Bastian stood there. He didn't quite know why he had said all he had, and admitted so much. He hated being questioned like that. He broke into a sweat as it occurred to him that he was already late for school. He'd have to hurry. Oh, yes, he'd have to run, but he just stood there, unable to move. Something held him fast. He didn't know what. He could hear the muffled voice from the back of the room. It was a long telephone conversation. It came to Bastian that he'd been staring the whole time at the book that Mr. Coriander had been holding and that was now lying on the armchair. He couldn't take his eyes off of it. It seemed to have a kind of magnetic power that attracted him irresistibly. He went over to the chair, slowly held out his hand and touched the book. In that moment, something inside him went as though a trap had shut. Bastian had a vague feeling that touching the book had started something irrevocable, which would now take its course. He picked up the book and examined it from all sides. It was bound in copper-colored silk that shimmered when he moved it about. Leafing through the pages, he saw the book was printed in 2 colors. There seemed to be no pictures, but there were large, beautiful capital letters at the beginning of the chapters. Examining the binding more closely, he discovered 2 snakes on it, one light and one dark. They were biting each other's tails, so forming an oval. And inside the oval, in strangely intricate letters, he saw the title. The Never-Ending Story. Human passions have mysterious ways in children as well as grown-ups.
Those affected by them can't explain them, and those who haven't known them have no understanding of them at all. Some people risk their lives to conquer a mountain peak. Not one, not even they themselves, can really explain why. Others ruin themselves trying to win the heart of a certain person who wants nothing to do with them. Still others are destroyed by their devotion to the pleasures of the table. Some are so bent on winning a game of chance that they lose everything they own, and some sacrifice everything for a dream that can never come true. Some think that their only hope of happiness lies in being somewhere else, and spend their whole lives traveling from place to place, and some find no rest until they have become powerful. In short, there are so many difficult passions as there are people.
Bastian Balthazar Bucks's passion was books. If you have never heard whole afternoons with burning ears and rumpled hair forgetting the world around you over a book, forgetting cold and hunger, if you have never read secretly under the bedclothes with a flashlight because your father or mother or some other well-meaning person has switched off the lamp on the plausible ground that it was time to sleep before you had to get up so early, if you've never wept bitter tears because a wonderful story has come to an end and you must take a leave of the characters with whom you have shared so many adventures, whom you have loved and admired, for whom you have hoped and feared, and without whose company seems empty and meaningless. If such things have not been a part of your own experience, you probably won't understand what Bastian did next. Staring at the title of the book, he turned hot and cold, cold and hot. Here was just what he had dreamed of, what he had longed for ever since the passion for books had taken hold of him. A story that never ended. The book of books. He had to have this book. At any price. At any price? That was easily said. Even if he had had more to offer than the bit of pocket money he had on him, this cranky Mr. Coriander had given him clearly to understand that he would never sell him a single book. And he certainly wouldn't give it away. The situation was hopeless. Yet Bastian knew he couldn't leave without the book. It was clear to him that he'd only come to the shop because of this book. It had called him in some mysterious way, because it wanted to be his, because it had somehow always belonged to him. Bastian listened to the bubbling from the little black room. In a twinkling, before he knew it, he had the book under his coat and was hugging it with both arms. Without a sound, he backed up the street door, keeping an anxious eye on the other door, the one leading to the back room. Cautiously, he turned the door handle to keep the brass bells from ringing. He opened the glass door just wide enough for him to slip through. He quietly closed the door behind him. Only then did he start running. The books, copybooks, pens, and pencils in his satchel jingled and rattled to the rhythm of his steps. He had a stitch in his side, but he kept on running. The rain came down on his face and into his collar. The wet cold passed through his coat, but Bastian didn't feel it. He felt hot all over, but not from running. His conscience, which had let out a peep in the bookshop, had suddenly woken up. All the arguments that had seemed so convincing melted away like snowmen under the fiery breath of a dragon. He had stolen. He was a thief. What he had done was worse than common theft. That book was certainly the only one of its kind and impossible to replace, and it was surely Mr. Coriander's greatest treasure. Stealing a violinist's precious violin or a king's crown wasn't at all the same as flinching money from a cash drawer, which is very true. As he ran, he hugged the book tight under his coat. Regardless of what this book might cost him, he couldn't bear to lose it. It was all he had left in the world. Because naturally he couldn't go home anymore. He tried to imagine his father at work in the big room he had furnished as his laboratory. Around him lay dozens of plaster casts of human teeth, for his father was a dental technician. Bastian had never stopped to ask himself whether his father enjoyed his work. It occurred to him now for the first time, but now he would never be able to ask him. If he went home now, his father would come out of his lab in a white smock, possibly holding a plaster case, and he would ask, "Home so soon?" "Yes," Bastian would reply. "No school today?" He saw his father's quiet, sad face, and he knew he couldn't possibly lie to him. Much less could he tell him the truth. No, the only thing left for him to do was to go away somewhere, far, far away. His father must never find out that his son was a thief.
And maybe he wouldn't even notice that Bastian wasn't there anymore. Bastian would find this thought almost comforting. He had stopped running. Walking slowly, he saw the schoolhouse at the end of the street. Without thinking he was taking his usual route to school, he passed a few people here and there, yet the street seemed deserted. But to a schoolboy arriving very, very late, the world around the schoolhouse always seemed to have gone dead. At every step he felt the fear rising within him. Under the best of circumstances, he was afraid of school, the place of his daily defeats, afraid of his teachers, who gently appealed to his conscience or made him the butt of their rages, afraid of the other children who made fun of him and never missed a chance to show him how clumsy and defenseless he was. He had always thought of the school years as a prison term with no end in sight. A misery that would continue until he grew up, something he would just have to live through. But when he now passed through the echoing corridors with their smell of floor wax and wet overcoats, when the lurking stillness suddenly stopped his ears like cotton, and when at last he reached the door of his classroom, which was painted the same old spinach color as the walls around it, he realized this too was no place for him. He would have to go away, so he might as well go at once. But where to? Bastian had read stories about boys who ran away to sea and sailed out into the world to make their fortune. Some became pirates or heroes. Others grew rich, and when they returned home years later, no one could guess who they were. But Bastian didn't feel up to that kind of thing. He couldn't conceive anyone taking him on as a cabin boy. Besides, he had no idea how to reach a seaport with suitable ships for such an undertaking. So where could he go? Suddenly he thought of the right place, the only place where, at least for the time being, no one could find him or even look for him. The attic of the school was large and dark. It smelled of dust and mothballs, not a sound to be heard except for the muffled drumming of the rain on the enormous tin roof. Great beams, blackened with age, rose at regular intervals from the plank floor, joined with other beams at head height, and lost themselves in the darkness. Here and there, spider webs, big as hammocks, swayed gently in the air currents. A milky light fell from a skylight on the roof. The one living thing in this place where time seemed to stand still was a little mouse that came hobbling across the floor, leaving tiny footprints in the dust, and between them a fine line, a tail print. Suddenly it stopped and pricked up its ears, and then it vanished, whoosh, into a hole in the floor. The mouse had heard the sound of a key in a big lock. The attic door opened suddenly with a loud squeak. For a moment, a long strip of light crossed the room. Bastian slipped in. Then again with a squeak, the door closed. Bastian put the big key in the lock from inside and turned it. Then he pushed the bolt and heaved a sigh of relief. Now no one could possibly find him. No one would look for him here. The place was seldom used, he was pretty sure of that. And even by chance someone had something to do in the attic today or tomorrow, he would simply find the door locked. And the key would be gone, and even if they somehow got the door open, Bastian would have time to hide behind the junk that was stored there. Little by little, his eyes got used to the dim light. He knew the place. Some months before he had helped the janitor to carry a laundry basket full of old copybooks up there, and then he had seen where the key to the attic door was kept, in a wall cupboard next to the topmost flight of stairs. He hadn't thought of it since, but today he had remembered. Bastian began to shiver. His coat was soaked through, and it was cold in the attic. The first thing was to find a place where he could make himself more or less comfortable, because he took it for granted that he'd have to stay here a long time. How long? The question didn't enter his head, nor did it occur to him that he would soon be hungry and thirsty. He looked around for a while. The place was crammed with junk of all kinds. There were shelves full of old files and records. Benches and ink-stained desks were heaped up every which way. A dozen old maps were hanging on an iron frame. There were blackboards that lost a good deal of their black, and cast-iron stoves, broken-down pieces of gymnasium equipment, including a horse with the stuffing coming out through the cracks at its side, and a number of solid mats. There were also quite a few stuffed animals, at least what the moths had left of them. A big owl, a golden eagle, a fox, and so on. Cracked retorts and other chemical equipment, a galvanometer, a human skeleton hanging on a clothes rack, and a large number of cartons full of old books and papers. Bastian finally decided to make his home on the pile of old gym mats. When he stretched out onto them, it was almost like lying on a sofa. He dragged them to the place under the skylight where the light was best. Not far away he found a pile of gray army blankets. They were dusty and ragged, but they didn't matter now. He carried them over to his nest. He took off his wet coat and hung it on the clothes rack beside the skeleton. The skeleton jiggled and swayed, but Bastian had no fear of it. Maybe because he was used to seeing such things at home. He also removed his wet shoes, and in his stocking feet he squatted down on the mats and wrapped himself in the gray blankets like a native. Beside him lay his school satchel and the copper-colored book. It passed through his mind that the rest of them down in the classroom would be having a history lesson then. Maybe they'd be writing compositions on some deadly dull subject. Bastian looked at the book. "I wonder," he said to himself, "what's in a book while it's closed? Oh, I know it's full of letters printed on paper, but all the same, something must be happening." Sorry about that, y'all. Bit of a technical difficulty. Oh, I know it's full of letters printed on paper, but all the same, something must be happening, because as soon as I open it, there's a whole story with people I don't know yet, and all kinds of adventures and deeds and battles, and sometimes there are storms at sea, or it takes you to strange cities and countries. All those things are somehow shut up in a book. Of course you have to read it to find out, but it's already there. That's the funny thing. I just wish I knew how it could be. Suddenly, an almost festive mood came over him. He settled himself, picked up the book, opened it to the first page, and began to read The Neverending Story. And that is where we will end for tonight. I know that's the prologue, but we haven't started chapter 1 until tomorrow night. Let's just give a gander of how many chapters we have to go through, y'all. Okay. So we have 26 chapters. I will say this. Another reason why I love this book, and it is my favorite book of all time, is because I really relate to the main character of Bastian Balthazar Bucks. My mother, my aunts and uncles could tell you I was bullied a lot in elementary school. This is way before I came out. Kids were very hateful to me and very cruel. I remember being pushed downstairs. I remember being punched, kicked, like slapped, beat up in the bathroom, had my underwear pull over my head. Like, that was totally a thing. Kids were very cruel to me. And even to go even further, I had a lot of students who were also black like myself, who constantly told me that I wasn't black enough because I was light-skinned, because of the way I spoke, because of the way I carried myself, because of my hobbies and interests. And people were very cruel. And if I'm gonna be honest, that low-key traumatized me for a long time to make connections with certain people. My mother can attest to this. My dad can attest to this, actually. That I was a very independent, lonely child. And I got along with people. But for the most part, I stayed to myself because it was easier to just be by myself than to be hurt by somebody that was eventually going to make fun of me for what I liked. And I didn't have a strong voice until I started reading. And I read books to escape the pain and the traumas of being mistreated by people who I thought could be my friends, or people I thought would be nice to me. And my mother says something that has stuck with me to this very day. She said, "Chris, not everybody is going to think like you or act like you. Everybody is different. Not everybody is here to be your friend. But that's okay. It's not what they call you. It's what you answer to." And I've always taken that to heart. And even though I've had very cruel things happen to me as a child, I've never had that warp my mind to think that that was okay to do to somebody else. Even, it takes a lot for me to get mad. Anybody knows me well enough knows it takes a lot to upset me and really get me enraged. It's a rarity that it ever happens, but when it does, oh, it's a show. But like, I love this story. I'm glad I get to read it to you all, and I will see you all tomorrow. Peace.